Well, greetings everybody. Welcome to another session in the studies of church history. If you remember last time, and I hope you remember something about last time, we took a look at the development of the Reformation on the continent of Europe, particularly the work of the two greatest of the reformers, Martin Luther and John Calvin. Today we want to continue our look at the things related to the Reformation, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Reformation as it developed in Britain. Now, if any of the things that we've been talking about in recent weeks related to church history in any way look at all like, yeah, sounds like ancient history or whatever, hard to relate to, and hopefully by the time we got to the Reformation last week, some of that may have passed. But today, maybe it'll start to seem a little more current, even though it's still 500 years ago or so. We're familiar with this story probably more than we are many of the stories that we've talked about before. But it may be that by talking about the events of this story today, we will be able to bring a lot of these events into better focus, and also perhaps be able to understand better just how religion played a role in all these things. You know, my sense is that these days, in fact, I'm really convinced this is probably the case, that we don't take religion anywhere near as seriously as these folks did back then. As a matter of fact, part of our reaction to some of these stories is, you know, how can religion have been that important? How could they have done the things they did just over something like religion? You know, most of us these days tend to think that everybody has a right to believe whatever they want to believe, and we should have respect for everybody and their individual differences of belief and so forth. Well, it certainly has not always been the case, and of course, as we know, it's not always the case that way today. There are an awful lot of people who do not think that other people have the right to disagree with them at all, and there are those who want to impose their will, their religious will on other people and other groups. And I'm not just talking about people in other religions from other lands. We have people who call themselves Christians who live in our own land who would very much like to impose their way of viewing things and doing things on others. Maybe we'll get into some of that as time goes on. But I want to get into this story today about the Reformation as it occurred in Britain. And again, you probably are familiar with much of this story. And one of the things that is very obvious about this and very clear on the very face of the story is that this is, it's an incredibly brutal story, a very bloody story. And in some ways, you probably will hear these things, and if you haven't heard about them before, or even if you have, you might think, it's really shocking that these things happened, that people could behave the way that they did, so forth and so on. But nevertheless, let's go ahead and get into this. Talked about the reasons why the Reformation occurred in the continent of Europe, and that there were a lot of conditions that went into making up a situation where the Reformation could arise. It wasn't just because Martin Luther was unhappy about things in the Catholic Church, but there was the rise of the Renaissance, and there was the technological developments such as the invention of the printing press that allowed ideas to be disseminated rapidly, and people who were just tired of the control that the Catholic Church had and the wealth that the Catholic Church had, and they wanted to get their hands on it. And so there were a lot of factors that went into the rise of the Reformation. And the same thing was going on in Britain as was going on in the European continent. Sometimes it's actually been said that the Reformation happened because Luther wanted a wife and Henry VIII wanted a divorce. Well, that's obviously a very simple answer, and in fact, it's not even true. Simple answers themselves rarely are. If you come upon a very simple answer to a complex question, it's probably not right. Things usually are a lot more complicated than we tend to give them credit for being. As far as Luther wanting a wife, there's simply no record of that anywhere. He did end up with a wife and children, but it just sort of seems to have happened as time went on. Not something that was there at the beginning and something he wanted to have happen. It is certainly true that Henry VIII wanted a divorce, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But even that idea as a reason for the Reformation in Britain is looking at things a little too simplistically. There were things that were in effect and things in motion that moved the Reformation along, even before the business with Henry VIII and him wanting to get a divorce, before all that came into play. We talked a little about some of this before. For instance, there was John Wycliffe, who began something of a Reformation movement in England, and gathered a following called the Lollards, and they gathered around Wycliffe, and so there was the beginnings of a Reformation movement in England clear back in the 1400s. And also we come upon a man by the name of William Tyndale. Tyndale translated the Bible into English, which was a big deal. Not something that the Catholic Church wanted to have happen, and they were at the time totally in control. But they had their own Bible, they had the Latin Bible, and they wanted it to be the Bible because it allowed them to have more control. And that was an awful lot of what this was about. Who's going to be in control? Who's going to have control? So Wycliffe wanted to, again, put the Bible in the hands of people, and they could read it in their own languages. In this particular case, English. One of the cool things that Wycliffe did was, or Tyndale rather, did was that he translated the Bible into English, not from the Latin Bible, but directly from the Greek manuscripts. Pretty cool. He didn't do all that great of a job, although any job at all when you're translating the Bible from the original language is a pretty good job. But there were some mistakes in it, and Tyndale did his best to correct these mistakes as time went on. But it gave people an opportunity to criticize his Bible, and Tyndale had to go into hiding. He did, in fact, he had to get out of England, at least for a while, smuggled a lot of Bibles into England, sold. He made some money on the Bible, but he plowed it right back into publishing more Bibles, went back into England, had to hide, finally was caught, and finally was condemned to death. He was tied to a stake, and he was strangled to death, after which his body was burned. But his last words were said, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." So, yeah, and a lot of people heard about what happened to him, and he drew an awful lot of attention to himself and to the movement towards rebellion against against the king and against Catholicism, and again helped lay the groundwork for the Reformation in Britain. All right, well, we all know again about Henry VIII and how Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife Catherine of Aragon, who was Spanish, and was therefore a very staunch Catholic. And Henry himself was a very staunch Catholic. In fact, he wrote a pamphlet criticizing Luther, and because of his efforts to withstand Protestantism in England, the Pope actually declared him Defender of the Faith, and that is actually one of the titles that the English monarchs continue to maintain even to this day. Among everything else, they are the Defender of the Faith, which comes all the way back from those days. But Henry had a big problem. He wanted a male heir, which Catherine of Aragon failed to produce for him. We all know this story, probably we heard it 100 times in movies and books and in every place else. Catherine did have 5 children. However, only one of them survived to adulthood, and that was a daughter named Mary. And Henry was desperate to have a male heir, and that was the reason why he did want to divorce Catherine so that he could marry Anne Boleyn. It wasn't simply because he had the hots for Anne Boleyn, no doubt he did, but Henry was the king and a total and complete autocrat who could do anything he wanted and have anybody he wanted and would have, but he wanted a new wife to have a legitimate heir, so he went about divorcing Catherine of Aragon and married Anne Boleyn. And what he did at that point was essentially that he separated himself from the church that was centered in Rome. He declared himself to be the head of the Church of England. However, he was not really a very good Protestant. He did not separate himself from the Church of Rome very far. Well, in one sense, he separated himself completely, declared himself to be the head of his own church. But there wasn't a great deal of difference between the church in England and the Catholic Church as it was practicing anywhere else. As a matter of fact, things even continued with the selling of indulgences under the auspices of the Church of England in England. However, Henry did raid the church riches. He destroyed monasteries and he confiscated church properties and church funds and took all that stuff for himself. So he became heavily enriched as a result of all of this efforts that he did. He continued his efforts to have a male heir. However, Anne Boleyn did not produce that male heir for him. She did produce another daughter, but he ended up, of course, having her beheaded and went on to have a total of 6 wives, another one of whom was beheaded, and others came to bad fates as well. Although I think it was only those 2 wives who were executed, and Catherine, who was divorced. I think another one died, and I think one survived him. Nevertheless, Jane Seymour was one of his wives, and she did produce a male heir, and that male heir became Edward the Sixth. And when Henry died, Henry was crowned king at age 9. England was ruled by a regent under Henry, but Henry was the king. Unfortunately, Henry did not live long. He actually only lived 6 years after being crowned king. After which point in time, now by the way, Henry was raised as a Protestant. He was the first English king to be raised as a Protestant. But when he died, then that meant that the king had to go, or the crown had to go to Henry's oldest surviving child, which was none other than the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, who had been, of course, young Mary. And Mary was crowned king and queen, and Mary was very staunch Catholic. One was that her lineage was Spanish. She had great allegiance to Spain. Spain was very Catholic, very much in alignment with the papacy, and so Mary, she hated the Protestants because they, in the divorce, they called Catherine, not a legitimate wife, and therefore Mary was a bastard, not a legitimate child. That didn't go over well with the new Queen Mary, and so Mary then turned her attention to the persecution of the Protestant church in England, and I've heard it said that things weren't really as bad under Mary as they were in other parts of Europe. But they were still pretty bad. Mary ended up burning about 300 Protestants at the stake. And she picked up a nickname that has remained in currency ever since. You've no doubt heard of Bloody Mary. That's where the name comes from. The Protestants called her Bloody Mary. She maintained her anti-Protestant programs and persecution for as long as she was queen. However, that didn't last all that long. That actually, she, I think, reigned just 5 or 6 years, and then she died. Even though she had married the heir to the Spanish throne, which again was firmly Catholic, she did not produce an heir. And so when she died, then they looked to Henry's other children. The next oldest child was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, who just happened to be named Elizabeth. Now I want to back up just a little bit and mention a couple of things that I didn't talk about the persecution of the Protestants under Queen Mary. because this persecution of the Protestants under Queen Mary actually had a large impact in terms of the success of the Protestant church in later days, because wow, this horrible persecution and the burnings and so forth drew an awful lot of sympathy to the martyrs, to the Protestant faith in England. And so there was a lot of sympathy to them, and people were ready to return to Protestantism when they were given a chance. There were a couple of people, a couple of other interesting things to point out about that. We perhaps all know a hymn that we sing occasionally, at least, "Faith of Our Fathers." Well, it wasn't originally a Protestant hymn. As a matter of fact, one of the early verses of that hymn actually reads, "Faith of our fathers, Mary's faith." I should say, "Faith of our fathers, Mary's prayers will win all England back to thee." So that hymn involved a prayer that England would return to the Catholic fold, even after it had been returned to Protestantism. Nevertheless, there were among those who were martyred or burned at the stake under Mary's persecution were a couple of men who were burned together, Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley. And as the fires were being lit, Latimer said, "Be of good comfort, Mr. Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust shall never be put out." So back to the old idea that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, and that in fact was at least partially true with the martyrs under Queen Mary, because when Mary died after her short time on the throne, her sister Elizabeth ascended to the throne, and here we have one of course, history's most incredible, remarkable women, human beings, and the impact that she had on England and ultimately on the world was probably very hard to measure. Elizabeth, being the daughter of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, was raised a Protestant, and also in the same way that Mary was raised to hate Protestants, Queen Elizabeth had been raised to hate Catholics, because just like Mary, her mother had been proclaimed a whore, this time by the Catholics, and that she herself had been proclaimed a bastard by the Catholics rather than the Protestants talking about Queen Mary. So, in fact, it was inevitable that she would be a Protestant, and she certainly was. She not only hated the Catholics for all those things that was related to her own family history and to their treatment and discussion about her, but she knew that the Catholics wanted to get rid of her. No surprise there. And what the Catholics wanted to do was replace her with a Catholic queen in the northern country, Scotland, and she was a cousin of Elizabeth by the name of Mary. Seems like everybody's name was Mary, and this was a woman who became known to history as Mary, Queen of Scots, and a little bit more about her as we dig just a little bit deeper. Queen Elizabeth brought about a number of reforms, did increase the worship of Protestantism in England, solidified Protestant rule, and had tremendous impact in doing that. But there were others who were reformers who thought that Elizabeth in her work had not gone far enough. There was a group, and what their intent was that they said that the Reformation had not gone far enough, that the church not only needed to be reformed, the church needed to be purified. And so these people picked up a name that they were known by, and still are known by, even if we didn't know the name, where the name came from, and that name was the Puritans. They wanted the church pure. They wanted the church cleansed even further. And they they were very, of course, very strong Protestants. And when Queen Mary retook the throne, they got out of England and went to Europe, particularly went to Holland. And they were there until Queen Elizabeth took the throne, and they headed back to England and brought their ideas, and particularly their Calvinism, with them, which they picked up in even greater fashion on the continent. And they were unhappy with just about everything that was going on in the church in England, and they wanted to rid it of all influences of Catholicism. One of the things that had happened that had been very important in the Church of England was the use of the prayer book in the Church of England. The book of Common Prayer, the prayer book of the Church of England, has been a significant, very significant element all through the history of the Church of England, down to this current day in Episcopalian churches around the world. And it was a dynamic force under Elizabeth in the Church of England. But the Puritans, they didn't like it. As a matter of fact, what they called it, they said that the prayer book of the Church of England had been plucked out of that popish dunghill, the book of the Mass. So they weren't happy with the use of the prayer book, and that had become very important to the life of the Church of England, and as I said, remained that way. Also, they wanted the Church in England to follow the teachings of the Geneva Church under Calvin that they picked up while they were over there, and that meant that they wanted the church to be governed through the democratic election of elders, as happened under the Calvinistic system. Elizabeth, of course, didn't like the work of the Puritans. She passed laws to bring about their oppression. As a matter of fact, in 1593, there was a Welsh pamphleteer. His name was John Penry, and he was hanged for espousing Puritanism. So there was certainly significant persecution and prosecution of the Puritans, even as a part of the English Reformation that was going on. And there were others who thought maybe even the Puritans did not go far enough. They wanted to separate themselves from the rest of the Church of England, and they would not even remain loyal to the Church of England, and they wanted to be separate, and they were called the Separatists, and sometimes they couldn't even get along with each other, and they separated from one another. Well, some of them were so determined to separate that they went back to Holland, were there in Holland for a while, decided even that wasn't good enough, and so they separated from Holland, and they fled to the New World and formed the Plymouth Colony, a group that we typically call the Pilgrims. Those were a separatist group that had essentially left England during that time for those particular reasons. Now, there was also another group of English separatists who were following a man named John Smythe. And John Smythe had come under the influence of some Mennonites, and he was influenced by their ideas. And one of the things that he picked up on was this whole idea about how infant baptism simply wasn't good enough. Baptism was something that was had to be adults only after a confession of faith and so forth. So he baptized himself, and then he baptized some of his followers. And his followers came to be known as Baptists. And his followers, the followers of John Smythe, became the first English-speaking Baptist. And Baptist, of course, became a very, very powerful movement, especially in the New World. They still are today. Maybe, I don't know, maybe there are more Christians who call themselves Baptists in America than there are any other kind. Certainly, the Southern Baptist Church is the largest Protestant denomination in America all by itself. So there are lots and lots of Baptists, lots and lots of independent churches who who are Baptist in type and in style and so forth. One of the things that the Baptists were really noted for and were very strong in was their insistence upon the separation of church and state. Over the centuries, they were as consistent as any other group, maybe more so, in insisting upon that separation. And I found it very interesting in thinking about that because we Americans, at least in the lifetime of many of us, have prided ourselves on being a land of freedom of religion and a place where there was separation of church and state. However, we actually do live in a time and in a country now where there are those who definitely want to eliminate that line between church and state, who definitely want there to be an official church, American state religion, which is fundamentalist Christianity. That is a movement that has been in place for some time. Much of it has been behind the scenes, but we're seeing it much more out in front these days. So it's interesting. I wonder again if Baptists have been supporters of the separation of church and state for all these centuries. I wonder if it's still as strong today. But that's just an offhanded thought. May not have any meaning or value whatsoever. Nevertheless, something to think about. Okay, going to move on to the next part of this business about the Reformation in Britain. And we want to talk about John Knox and the beginning of the Reformation in Scotland. Well, this has very particular relevance to us, to we Presbyterians, because whether or not we individually can trace our personal lineage to Scotland, and as far as I know, I cannot, we're a Scottish church. The church comes from Scotland. That's why we're called Presbyterian. I think I've explained this before, that the word Reformed really refers to the followers of John Calvin and his teachings, and therefore we are Reformed Christians. And when Reformed Christians from the continent came to the colonies, they brought their churches with them and they formed Reformed churches, Dutch Reformed, German Reformed, so forth. But when the Reformed Christians from Scotland came to America, they formed those same Reformed churches, but they were called Presbyterian churches. So nevertheless, that's where we trace our lineage from, has great relevance to us. Some of that we can be very proud of, I think, and other aspects of it, maybe not quite so much. As a matter of fact, more than to any other, the Reformation in Scotland owes its success to a chaplain of a group of assassins, and that was a man by the name of John Knox. Knox, an amazing guy, and even after these centuries, we look back at who he was and what he did, and he remains controversial. One of his biographies, and I'll read the quote from his biographer, said, "What Knox really did was rob Scotland of all the benefits of the Renaissance. Scotland never enjoyed these as England did, and no doubt the lack of that immense advantage has had a permanent effect. It can be felt, I imagine, even at the present day." Okay, John Knox stopped the Renaissance in Scotland. Maybe that's exactly what he had in mind. I don't know. But on the other hand, one Presbyterian historian, to look to another quote, said of John Knox, in relating to the contest that we'll talk a little bit about between Knox and Mary Queen of Scots, he says that not only the fate of Protestantism, but the fate of the whole world, and particularly the fate of our nation, the nation at that point still to be born, rested on the shoulders of one man. This biographer credits the church for which Knox crusaded with being the major force in establishing not only Protestantism, but both democracy and education in Scotland and then in America. Now, if you weren't listening, I'm going to say it again. Credit to John Knox for not only establishing Protestantism in Scotland and finally in America, but also democracy and education as well. How's that for a legacy? It's not his only legacy. It's a good part of it. Okay, back to the business about they being a chaplain to a bunch of assassins. It was in the year 1545 in St. Andrews. There was a Protestant preacher, and again, this was before the Reformation actually took any kind of hold there. So he was a heretic. His name was George Wishart, and he was burned at the stake. No surprise there. That's what you did with heretics. Well, there were those who were not happy with that turn of events, and so a few days later, there were 16 young upper-class Scottish youths who broke into the St. Andrews Castle, and they stabbed the Catholic Cardinal Beaton to death. So yeah, there was an assassin there. Now Knox was a 31-year-old Catholic priest at the time. He was not one of the assassins, probably, but he joined them soon after. And with them, they were entrenched in St. Andrew's Castle, and a force of Scottish troops who had been joined by a troop of Frenchmen. They marched on the castle, and there was a negotiation, and there was a compromise, and Knox and the others were promised that they could go to France, and after they got to France, they could go wherever they wanted to go. And so they said, okay, we'll take the deal, and they did, but then the Scots and the French reneged on the deal, and Knox was then chained to an oar, and he was made a galley slave on a French vessel for 18 months. There was this one little vignette of one day when he was a slave on that ship. They sailed past St. Andrews, and he saw the temple or the spire of the castle church, and prophesied that he would preach there again one day. And maybe he had never actually preached there before, but said that he would. However, he remained a slave for some time longer. However, the time came when he was finally released under the auspices of England, and he returned to England, and he became one of King Edward's chaplains. Had some significant work there. As a matter of fact, helped to draft the 39 Articles of the Church of England. But yeah, I mean, Edward was the king. Didn't live very long. Mary became queen. Tried to reinstitute Catholicism, and so Trump is in, or not Trump. Knox is in trouble once again. I think I meant to say trouble. Okay. And so he was in trouble once again, and he fled to France. And there he stirred the wrath of another Mary of the Guise family. You might remember her name. She was of the Guise family, were the ones who had persecuted the Huguenots. And she actually her daughter was Mary Queen of Scots, and she was ruling Scotland as the regent at this time. And Knox, one of the things you've got to say about John Knox is he never read the book How to Win Friends and Influence people. He had no tact whatsoever. He would say whatever was on his mind, no matter how horrible or offensive it might have been. And he actually wrote a book, and he was basically railing against Queen Mary and railing against Queen Mary of England and Mary of Guise, the regent of Scotland, and Mary, Queen of Scots herself, who was not yet come into her reign. So in attacking them, he wrote a pamphlet called First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. Not designed to gain him an awful lot of favor among the women he was railing against, and it did not, and so he had to run to Geneva to get out of France. especially after calling Mary of Gaza Jezebel. He went to Geneva, where he loved Geneva, loved what was going on there, called it the most perfect school of Christ since the days of the apostles. Powerfully influenced by what he learned there, and then went back to Scotland, and he was determined to make it a Presbyterian country. Well, when he got there, there was rebellion, there was riots. Again, monasteries were burned, images in the churches were burned, stained glass windows were smashed, churches were looted. It says that Knox himself did not approve of all of this, but he didn't step in and stop it. He hated Catholicism. He called the Pope the Antichrist. He called the Mass idolatry. And so Scotland was ready to listen, just like much of the rest of Europe had been ready to listen to Luther for much of the same reasons, and that had to do with such things as there was lots of money, lots of land. The Catholic Church owned enormous amounts of real estate in Scotland, and there were Scottish lords who wanted to get their hands on it, and so they were ready to follow John Knox. Well, there was conflict there between Elizabeth and Scotland, and so they did go off in their separate ways, and that allowed John Knox to have the freedom to do the things that he did without the tremendous opposition that he might have otherwise gotten from England. Although England was Protestant, there were certainly some differences there, and we'll talk about some of them, if not today, next time. But finally, Mary, Queen of Scots, did begin her reign. And remember that she was Catholic, her mother French, and very committed to Catholicism. However, to give Mary, Queen of Scots, credit, she tried to win Knox over by charm, not by force. But there was no way that Knox was going to have anything to do with this this Catholic queen ruling there. And he was preaching in the Church of St. Giles. And he went so far as to call Mary, Queen of Scots, a slave of Satan. And she responded by calling him a traitor, and tried to force him out of his positions, the power that he had entrenched around him. But Protestantism was too firmly established at that point to have any kind of difference. And again, this is the kind of thing that's being made into movies and so forth. Mary, Queen of Scots, her personal life dissolved into disaster. And when I say disaster, I mean disaster. It involved a couple of bad marriages and adulteries and murders and so forth. And the people just finally couldn't take it anymore. The Scots just finally forced her out of Scotland. She went to England, and Elizabeth there placed her under house arrest, and she remained under house arrest for many years, until finally it became clear to Elizabeth that Mary was actually fomenting a movement to replace Elizabeth on the throne of England, which would have meant not only a loss for Elizabeth, but would also meant a return of England to Catholicism. So the whole thing was completely intolerable, and so Elizabeth then, after all those years of house arrest, did have Mary, Queen of Scots, beheaded. Okay, John Knox. Just kind of wrap things up here real quickly. John Knox was determined that when he got back to Scotland, he was going to turn Scotland into a Presbyterian nation, and he did. He firmly established Presbyterian theology in the church. He firmly established Presbyterian government, not only on the church, but on the nation as well, to a large extent. He had the Church of Scotland adopted the Scots Confession, which is a very strongly Calvinistic statement of doctrine, which again was largely the work of Knox. He also adopted the Book of Discipline. And the Book of Discipline, among other things, called for a Presbyterian form of government in the church. It also called for universal education, called for relief of the poor, had a number of other kinds of social impacts on the nation at that time. Scotland became firmly Presbyterian. It remains that. I don't know how significantly. I think we know that that England is still officially the church. The state church is the Church of England. How significant of a social force that is in English life, I really don't know. Here, that not many people are attending. It's the same in Scotland. The Church of Scotland today is Presbyterian, but again, that may be something that's maybe historic more than anything else. I'm unable to answer that right at the moment. But John Knox did leave a church determined to defeat Catholicism once and for all, and for the nation to never be subject to any other nation ever again. I don't know how well that worked out. We all know that they are part of the United Kingdom even now, but we have seen a movement in recent years for Scotland to redefine its own independence from England. And I guess I'm going to have to quit right now. Fortunately, I've said all I really intended to say. Sorry for the interruption. We're going to continue a little bit of discussion about the Reformation in the Church of England, in Britain next week, and start talking about the church coming to America. Thanks.